Are gay people born gay or do they choose to be gay? That actually is not the most important question to ask a gay person. In fact, I think Christians have wasted a lot of time and effort trying to answer this question while failing to get to the heart of the issue when dealing with homosexuality. From the Christian worldview, whether a person is born gay or not is inconsequential. It doesn't really matter. We're all born with sinful tendencies and desires. In fact, as Sam Albury points out, no one is born straight. And what he means by that is that we're all born with desires that are bent towards evil. Some towards homosexuality, some towards pornography, some towards adultery, some towards lust. But the call of Christ is for us to lay down our sinful desires and our tendencies and instead to choose Him. And we can do that because of the empowering work of what He did on the cross, where He died in our place for our sins. And He empowered us to live a righteous, holy life. And He clothed us in His righteousness. We're not forced to live in bondage to the bent of our sinful nature. I think that there's a better question to ask when dealing with the topic of homosexuality. And this question doesn't just deal with homosexuality specifically, but it could be applied to other topics as well. The LGBT community is often very passionate about what they perceive to be just and unjust, what they perceive to be justice and injustice. And I think that we as Christians could use what they are already passionate about as a launch pad to sharing the gospel with them. We can say, hey, I see that you're very passionate about what you perceive to be justice and injustice. But how do you know what is just and unjust? How do you know what is good and what is evil? And this brings us to the most important question that we can ask a gay person. Who defines what's right and wrong? Who defines what's good and evil? Who defines morality? Now, there are a couple ways that someone could answer this question, and I'll start with some of the more common responses, and then I'll work my way towards maybe some of the more difficult answers for us as Christians to respond to. So perhaps the most common answer that you'll hear is that society does. Society defines what's right and wrong. Society defines what's good and evil. But there are a couple problems with having society define the standard of morality. For one, we can all think of examples of societies that have actually had terrible standards of morality. For example, chattel slavery was considered an acceptable good in society in the United States, while Nazi Germany exterminating the Jewish people and actually even homosexual people was considered a good. So when society defines morality, it often does a terrible job at setting the standard of what's right and what's wrong. Just because society deems something as good doesn't make it good. And on the flip side, just because society deems something as bad doesn't make it bad. The other problem is that society is constantly changing. Its values are always shifting and changing. So what's good today might not be good tomorrow. What's considered evil today might not be considered evil tomorrow. And the problem with this is that society can always redefine its standard of morality to benefit itself when it's convenient. And we saw this with Nazi Germany, where suddenly the standard of what's good and what's evil was suddenly shifted. It was suddenly changed. A moral law that is always shifting and changing is no moral law at all. For a moral law to truly be binding and for it to truly have utility and purpose, it needs to stay constant. It needs to stay the same. We can't have what's right and what's wrong always shifting. But if we let society define what is good and what is evil, then we end up with a standard of morality that is always changing. Next, society is temporal. Societies come and go. And what this means is that when a society dies out or when a society is taken over by another group of people, what happens to that standard of morality? That standard of morality dies with it. A temporal morality is no morality at all. If we have true moral values, if we have a true standard of morality, it needs to be able to outlive us, because what's wrong today should be wrong tomorrow. What's good today should still be good tomorrow. The next most common response is that I define morality. I don't need anyone else to tell me what's right and wrong. I define what's right and wrong. And this falls into the same problems that society defining morality has. So, for one, we can all think of examples of individuals that have defined their own standard of morality, and they've come away with a pretty terrible standard of morality. Just because someone feels that the action they are doing is right does not make it right. And furthermore, what happens when my standard of morality clashes with someone else's standard of morality? What happens if our standards of morality differ? Who's the arbiter between us? Who ultimately wins? Is it the person with the louder voice? Is it the person with the majority? Or is it the person with the bigger guns? Because morality doesn't depend on any of those things. Morality is not dependent on who's in the majority. Morality is not dependent on who has the bigger gun or the bigger platform. No, what's good and evil is independent of all of that. And the other problem here is that if individuals define morality, what that means is that morality is just a matter of opinion. And a moral law that is just a matter of opinion is no moral law at all. For a moral law to be binding, it can't be a matter of opinion. Opinions aren't binding. Laws are. The other problem is that we're always changing. We're constantly changing. That means our values are always constantly changing as well. And our standard of morality can change as well. So what that means is that we can redefine our standard of morality simply when it's convenient for us, simply when it benefits us. Regardless of whether our actions are right or wrong, we can deceive ourselves into believing that what we're doing is right, when in fact it might actually be wrong. The other problem is that we're temporal, just like societies. People die out, people don't live forever. And what that means is that our standard of morality dies with us. It's a non-binding standard of morality. It's a standard of morality unto oneself. And that's no standard of morality at all. Now, someone might come back and might actually challenge your question and challenge the presuppositions. So they say, okay, I see why we need a moral law. But who says we need a moral lawgiver? Who says we need someone to define morality for us? And this is actually a really good question. Now, our response to this is that moral questions involve questions of value, and only persons can assign value. So let me break that down. Moral questions involve value. Moral questions already assume that we as humans are intrinsically valuable. They already assume our value. They ask, is it wrong to do such and such an action to this person? Is it wrong if we behave in this way? And what that assumes is that we are valuable, that our sexualities are valuable. It assumes this about ourselves. No one is going to ask, is it wrong for me to kick this pebble while I'm walking down the sidewalk? Why? Because that question doesn't really have any meaning. It's just a pebble. It doesn't have value. But if you're going to ask, is it wrong for me to kick this person walking down the sidewalk? Now that's a different question. It's a legitimate question. Why? Because people have value. Pebbles don't. So moral questions automatically assume that people are intrinsically valuable. And next, only persons can assign value. A piece of paper with ink written on it can't give itself value. It can't say, oh, I'm worth $100. I'm worth $50. No, persons need to assign value to that piece of paper with ink on it. And what this means for moral questions is that we need a moral lawgiver to give us a moral law. Now, some people might say, you know what? Science can tell us what's right and wrong. We don't need anyone else to tell us what's right and wrong. Well, we already discussed that we need persons to assign value. We need persons to define morality. We need a person to define morality. And science is not a person, so science cannot define what's right and wrong. In fact, science makes a pretty good case as to why you and I are actually not valuable. We're just products of chance. We are brought about by mindless, unguided processes. We're just a speck in the cosmos. Murder is nothing wrong. It's not a violation of purpose. Murder is simply a rearrangement of atoms from the naturalistic worldview. As John Lennox wrote in his book, God's Undertaker Has Science Buried God? Science can tell you that if you add strychnine to someone's drink, it will kill them. But science cannot tell you whether it is morally right or wrong to put strychnine in your grandmother's tea so that you can get your hands on her property. So morality is one of those questions that science actually can't answer. And the reason for this is we need a person to define morality for us. So for Christians, what do we believe? Well, we believe that God defines what's right and wrong. God defines our standard of morality. And this solves some of the problems that we saw earlier with society and with individuals. God is unchanging. God is everlasting. He's not temporal. He's not changing. And what this means is that our standard of morality is grounded as someone who is unchanging and everlasting. Our standard of morality is dependable because God is unchanging. What's good today will be good tomorrow. What's evil today will be considered evil tomorrow. And our standard of morality is binding because God is all powerful and he will take care of any injustice that happens in this world, in this life. He will deal with all of that in the life to come. God is also all good, and this is actually really important because this means his standard of morality is grounded in his character. The rules of morality that he sets for us are not arbitrary, but they are a reflection of his character. Anything that is good finds its grounding in his character, and anything that is evil is antithetical to who he is as a person. His rules aren't arbitrary, they are grounded in who he is. If you guys like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. And if you guys have any topics that you guys might want to see covered, any topics relating to theology, apologetics, or any Bible questions, feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below.